Hello everyone. As of late, many characters have been getting reruns, and finally is the time for the Wanderer to get his first rerun. To celebrate this and most importantly have you all informed on him, I'm gonna share my review of the Wanderer while going over the strengths and weaknesses he has. This review will help you to decide whether he's a good pull for you, judge whether his pros outweigh his negatives, and actually allow you to prepare for his negatives so that once you pull him, you can have as much enjoyment with him as possible. I'll briefly go into his kit, his free-to-play friendliness, how he stacks with other characters in Genshin, and more. With that said, let's get right into the video and talk about the Wanderer. The Wanderer is an animo DPS and quite a unique one at that, though I must say he does remind me quite a bit of Isa with his gameplay. He has some traits that only he possesses that set him apart from everyone else and that give him a fun twist. First, with his normal attacks, it's a series of 3 animal attacks. These attacks are ranged, akin to bow normal attacks, so you don't have to be close up to enemies to damage them. The same applies to his charge attacks. Now, as you can see, his damage is pretty underwhelming, but that's because his true strength lies within his skill. When you cast this skill, the Wanderer will float in the air and gain a significant increase to his normal and charge attacks. This buff allows him to deal much more damage than just standing on the ground, so you always want to attack this way. Now, you're not going to be able to stay in the air the entire time. As you can see, there's a blue stamina bar when in the air, and when it's empty he will fall to the ground, but the skill has a very short cooldown of 6 seconds, so you will be able to frequently be in this state. Beyond a damage increase, there are a lot of good things and benefits his skill brings that are underrated, I feel. First off, aesthetically, it's really cool how you're able to fight enemies in the air. It really gives you the feel and impression that you're a god fighting enemies beneath you. Next, in his skill, the Wanderer can actually move around instead of just hovering. He can actually fly upwards as well as forward, and this makes navigating the world significantly easier. If you're having difficulty climbing something, you can travel upwards. He isn't able to travel a great distance this way, but he'll still help nonetheless. Also, he can fly forward at a very high speed when you dash with them, and this makes reaching certain checkpoints so much easier. Honestly, it's a godsend. It's so much quicker and so much easier to reach daily things like missions, ley lines, and quests. And yes, of course there are teleport points, but often it'll get you near where you want to be but not actually where you want to be, and the Wanderer can solve with that sort of annoyance of not being at your destination immediately. This is especially true when hunting for resources like character materials. He's amazing for gathering materials. Materials can be a big pain sometimes just because they're so far apart from each other and there's so many of them, but with his skill being able to travel such a far distance and have a low cooldown at that, he makes these things far less of a pain. It's even better when you combine other fast characters with him, so you zoom across the world getting materials in a flash. Outside of aesthetics and traversal, there is also another combat trait his skill has. It has to do with the passive talent of his Jade Claimed Flower. Essentially, this talent acts as a secondary elemental resonance. How it works is that when the Wanderer uses his skill, and in the process of using his skill, if he's close to an enemy affected by a swirlable element, he will actually gain certain buffs based upon the element he comes into contact with. The 2 greatest buffs you should focus on is Pyro, which gives the Wanderer an extra 30% attack, and Cryo, which gives him an extra 20% crit rate. It's possible to have 2 of these buffs active at one time, but honestly it's difficult to pull this off, so you'll probably only have 1 active. Now, with the positives of his flight are unfortunately some negatives. It mainly boils down to one thing, which is the knockback the Wanderer has. This is what I would say is the most infamous thing of the Wanderer. When the Wanderer is hit while his skill is active, he'll have this animation where he'll fall down and he'll fly back up, and this is to be expected. Other characters have knockback when they get hit. The thing is, however, is that the Wanderer has the same knockback animation for pretty much every hit he takes. For other DPSs, if they take a big hit, yeah, they'll be knocked backwards, but if they take a light hit, let's say from a hilichurl, they'll just be still for a second after taking the hit, and then they're ready to get back into the fight. And for the Wanderer, even a small attack from a hilichurl causes him to fall down and fly back up. He reacts to every hit as if he's taking a big hit. Now, I have seen some people cut the animation short as the Wanderer won't actually fall down, but gather himself mid-air. But from my experience, he's never done this. Every time, he's just fallen down and just gone back up. This can get really frustrating. The time the animation takes for the Wanderer to gather himself takes double if not triple the time DPSs take to shake off a light attack, so you waste a good amount of time just waiting for the animation to finish, and you actually waste the precious blue stamina of your skill, since when you fall and fly back up, blue stamina is still being consumed, and a good amount at that. Finally, for the cherry on the top, it's possible for the Wanderer to actually be stuck in this animation. If he's constantly being attacked, he literally starts getting juggled as if Haley Trails are doing a freaking Street Fighter combo on him, and this can take what feels like an eternity to end. Because of this, you absolutely need some sort of protection from enemies when playing the Wanderer, which is a negative he has, and honestly counterintuitive since you'd think that him being up in the air he'll be safe from enemy attacks, but that couldn't be farther from the truth. As for the Wanderer's Burst, it's another animal attack he owns, of which has a decent energy cost of 80. Again, I must say this burst does remind me of Heizo, since they both sort of kick this animal ball, but the Wanderer's is more sadistic, violent, and hurtful.
Cry louder!
And it deals fairly decent damage. It's not a significant source of his overall damage, since majority of it will come from his normal attacks, but it's still a good enough burst that you should use it at the end of your combos when you can. Overall, the Wanderer has a good kit. It's a strong kit that, though isn't game breaking or is the strongest kit in the game, it has some good twists and unique mechanics that make him feel distinct from other DPSs or animal units. Some of these twists are prone to some really big headaches, like his knockbacks, which are much worse than the knockbacks that other units usually have. It can be really irritating, but as long as you solve this by pairing him with someone to protect him from these attacks, there's really no problem he has. He's a unit you can play without really any sort of headaches. Let's now get into how flexible and free-to-play friendly the Wanderer is when it comes to his weapons. In truth, the Wanderer is okay when it comes to free-to-play weapons. He's not great, nor is he bad. If you have Dodo Coattails, this is the best free-to-play option he has, and it's a good weapon for him overall. It gives a lot of attack while buffing his charged attacks, which you should be using often. Then there's the Frostbearer, which I forgot existed, the Oathsworn Eye, which gives attack but unfortunately is held back by its passive, which gives energy, and lastly the Mappa Mare. The Mappa Mare is in a bit of a weird spot. EM can work on him since of course he's animal and thus he'll be swirling, but the thing to note about the Wanderer is that he's more of a traditional DPS than a swirling unit like Kazuha. So the more traditional damage stats like crit and attack are better on him, so if you have no other option, then I'd say to use this. Outside of strictly free-to-play weapons, for gacha catalysts, there's the Wits, which is quite a good option. The crit damage it gives is high, and this combined with one of its passives, the Wanderer can deal some really good damage. Close to the Wits is the Blackcliff. It also gives crit damage, however it does have a worse passive that is very limited in its use. Finally is the Eye of Perception, which is a big surprise. Often this catalyst is seen as an outcast, it's pretty much never mentioned as a weapon a character can use, yet the Wanderer absolutely can and can find decent success with it. Now for more expensive weapons, the Battle Pass Catalyst is another really good option since it gives crit rate while buffing every other source of the Wanderer's damage a good amount. Last but not least, for 5 stars, outside of Nahida's and Kokomi's weapons, every 5 star is amazing on him. There's of course his signature weapon, but there's also the Lost Prayer, Memory of Dust, and the Skyward Atlas, all of which work wonderfully with him. As for the flexibility the Wanderer has in regard to his artifacts, he's actually quite flexible. You can use his dedicated set, which is for Desert Pavilion. You can also use for Shimenawa, which is a very popular set, and as such I'm sure many of you have. The only downside to this set is that it takes away energy, which will reduce the overall damage the Wanderer will deal since he won't be able to cast his burst. Aside from these 4 pieces, you can mix and match various 2 pieces. For example, sets that give animal damage bonus or attack. In common animal fashion, you could run 4 Viridescent on him. This set will reduce the damage he deals, but buff your teammates' damage. Since the Wanderer is a DPS, I'd lean more to 4 Pavilion as the set you should use, but you can use 4 Viridescent on him, and in certain situations it'll likely be better than Pavilion. I'll now get into the Wanderer's team comps, and just like his artifacts, he's flexible in this aspect as well. In fact, he's more flexible when it comes to his teams. For example, for his supports, you have a few characters to choose from. There's of course Farazan, who's the dedicated animal support. She's really good because she will reduce the animal resistance of enemies while also increasing the Wanderer's animal damage. Benny, who's Benny, and Yunjin, who will significantly increase normal attack damage, which the Wanderer will be constantly using. An honorable mention of these supports is Jean. With her C2 and C4 she becomes quite a good support for him, but only at these constellations is she good. Outside of them she really doesn't work as a support for him, so I won't count her since I'm sure most of you don't have these constellations, but just mention for those that do. Anyhow, the fact that he has so many supports he synergizes well with is a really good thing. You're not tied down to a certain character or forced to pull a specific unit as you are with other characters, rather you can make use of the units you already probably have and do well with them. Some of these supports are better than others, for example Benny and Farazan are better than Yunjin, but all serve their purpose and work well with them. A thing to note of these supports is that they are somewhat locked by constellations. Though this does technically apply to Bennett and Yunjin, they're already really good at C0, this mainly applies to Farazan. Firstly, she does have energy problems. I've heard of people running upwards of 300% energy on her and even then still struggling with her energy. My experience with her energy problems hasn't been as bad as that, but it is a headache solved by her C4. With her C4, it's a lot less annoying to play her, and she will deal more damage since she doesn't need as much ER, but instead can go for more damage dealing stats. C6 is like her C4 but on steroids. With her C6 there will be additional animal particles for her and the Wanderer to collect. Her burst will actually group enemies together as her skill does, increasing your DPS by a ton. And on top of all this, you gain 40% crit damage to all animal damage. Really, there's nothing to be said here. This constellation is crazy. It'll make her and the Wanderer much stronger. So just like, golly man. With this, I'm not saying that you shouldn't use her at C0, but know that the main chunk of her strength is locked behind her C6. Now for the Wanderer specific teams, it's kind of difficult to talk about because the Wanderer can be played in so many teams. He can be played in hyper carry teams where his damage is greatly buffed and he's the only one dealing damage, or more classic reaction teams where he, as with other units, are involved. It's hard to really pinpoint which team is better since they both have their pros, so I recommend for you to try the two and find out which team you prefer and think performs better than the other. But just know that the Wanderer can be played in all kinds of teams, so much so that it's possible that you won't get bored playing his teams since there's just so many teams to play him in. To conclude this video and answer whether you should pull for the Wanderer, first, if you like him, think he's a cool character and like his playstyle, you should pull for him. All my talks about his weaknesses and such are all useful, but they're secondary, since the biggest driver for your reason to pull him is that you like him, so you should go for him. For those of you that are meta players, as in you only care for the strongest units, then I wouldn't recommend him. This is not because he's bad or weak, but that he's a pretty well balanced character. I'd still argue that he's a fairly strong DPS, but definitely not the best DPS or a top DPS. For those of you that are more casual or care less for the meta, I would recommend him. His skill really is so useful, and then outside of the actual usefulness he has, he is a unique character that can bring some fun new experiences. I know I have been connecting him with Heizo, but really there is no character that fights enemies floating in the air as he does, so he's new in that regard, and he feels distinct from other characters. There's also his win favored state talent where you absorb different elements for different buffs. He also has a wide variety of teams he can be played in, so for the fun aspect I'd say he fulfills it really well. And that is my entire review of the Wanderer. I hope you enjoyed the video as well as my review. Hopefully you learned something new about him, as well as something that will help you in deciding whether you'll be going for him or not. Please let me know what you thought of my review, whether you agree with it or disagree with it, and whether you'll be pulling for him. If you do end up pulling for him, good luck with your wishes. If you enjoyed the video, please consider liking and subscribing. And with that, I'm gonna end the video. Thank you all for watching, take care, and thank you all once again.